And we're live. We're live. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Red Hoop Talk. I'm Roy, and my sister Shannon sitting next to me. How you doing, Shannon?
Hello, Roy. I'm doing good. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. I'm just gonna saged off the show this time.
Thank
Cleaned
you.
everything up. Want to go ahead and throw a shout out to the first people of Southern California upon whose land we stand, the Chumash, the Kinnamuks, the Serranos, the Gabrielino, Luciano, Cahillas, the Cumies, and of course, Pavagna. And Shannon, you want to recognize the folks you're standing on's dirt?
After our conversation last week, the Piscataway people and other nations that came around the Maryland, Virginia, DC area. I'm grateful to follow in your footsteps. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, cool. So, what is going on this week?
Oh God, what isn't going on this week, Roy? Things are supposedly opening back up, and are you going anywhere?
I'm not doing anything because I'm watching I have a sister-in-law who works in the hospital. She's a nurse, and she says that the COVID cases are starting to rise again. They're going up again in her hospital, and it's summertime, and it's supposed to be going down in summertime, and everybody's opening back up. But I live in a it's very politically divided where I live. You know that. So yeah. There are a lot of people here. So what we have going on is we have the mask wearers and the no mask wearers. So we got the spreaders and the people who don't want to spread. So we got this craziness going on out here in Southern California. So I'm a little leery going out there because it's politically, it's just a weird situation. And I'm not out working yet, so I'm not too extremely worried about it.
Right.
As far as doing anything. Do have plumbing problems this week though. Pipe broke and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But what about you? What's going down?
Just been staying at home, looking a lot at what's going on in the news. Interesting that last week we had Dr. Sonia Adelaide on talking about repatriation.
Yes.
And this week, California, the state of California, released its audit report on whether the California university systems are complying with NAGPRA, and basically pulled out how disparate Berkeley's practices were from other universities.
Wow.
That Berkeley had only maybe done about 20% of their NAGPRA compliance activities, while others, were much further along, 80% complete and what have you. And Berkeley has been extremely problematic on repatriation issues because some of the academics and so-called scientists that are there that believe they should have absolute scientific reign over our Native American ancestors' bodies.
How did Cal State Long Beach fare? How do they fare on the whole situation?
Oh, the whole Cal State system and the UC system are flawed. And I think a lot of university systems are flawed because they're not putting the attention and the revenue and human resources into complying with NAGPRA. And so you see universities all over the country, there's more dead Indians on those campuses than there'll ever be Native students on their campuses. So, people have, there's a great group of folks. In fact, Sonia was a part of that called MACPRA. They're a coalition of Michigan tribal nations that are working together, and they were able to, through their advocacy, really embarrass and shame the heck out of University of Michigan and Michigan system. and start getting repatriation to occur. But it really took a lot of effort from tribes to get it going. And you see that in Southern California too, like the Tongva have just put in so much time and effort with Cal State Long Beach to try to protect the village site there, and also the ancestors that I think there may still be some in boxes there, but there has been some big repatriations there.
Now that's what I'm asking. I'm not saying, I know that none of them are probably in on the good side of things. I know that they're less than perfect, but
yeah,
with Berkeley is having its problems, and so even Long Beach is very flawed then, huh?
Oh yeah, and a lot of it's dependent on who's in their administration at any given time.
Well, and I know they had our uncle there, and they had a lot of other folks there that were advocates. When they found Pavagna, they did a lot of work there. We have the powwow there every year.
It's one of the oldest, central kind of pan-Indian movements there. A lot of UCLA and a lot of Cal State Long Beach people there. It's real history of Indian people since the removal area, not removal, the mid-century, the relocation era, when the government wanted to give Indians a better life and move them off reservation and into the cities. And so they did that, and then they just kind of left them there to hang.
That's what I don't understand, is because, these universities like, UCLA, USC, Long Beach, three very big cultural centers as far as Native peoples go, because, we have our powwows there every year. We're all very supportive of those universities and that program and the powwow program that we have there. So I'm surprised that there's not a little bit more advocacy and a little bit more work being done in those, in this LA area,
right.
University system. That's too bad. Well, you guys get your shit together, because it ain't cool. It ain't cool at all.
No,
I don't know what it's going to take, huh?
Yeah, I don't know either, except time, or what I've always said. We just, there's some white men who just need to pass on, and the next generation behind them take their place, because they do not want to comply with NAGPRA, and they're like hoarders. They do not want to let go of their booty.
There's claw marks on everything right now. The old powers that be, and I won't say it because you said it, but they're just clawing everything on their way out, it seems, and they are on their way out. News for you guys, it's almost the gig is up, baby. You guys are on your way out, so just keep clawing it. We'll have something to remember you by with your claw marks.
That's right. Just stoop down low enough so I can get on your shoulders and take us to the next level.
Well, there might end up being just a stack of bodies by the time you just have to pile them up and stand on top of them, is what it looks like it's turning out to be, because they're all getting wrecked. That's the term these days. But anyway, you had something else very interesting that we talked about earlier to share. Speaking of powers that be and guys, old white guys that are handling stuff needing to go away. Didn't you have a list of some things that were being done that we can show everybody that they can go to, and we can link to it and all that good stuff?
Yeah, well, last week you were talking about what was the Pebble Mine?
Pebble Mine, yes, the Pebble Mine. And the destruction that it's doing to the fisheries and native lands,
right.
Fisheries. Yeah.
And we were talking about how this administration has just rolled back every single environmental protection you could think of, especially anything Obama did, and especially anything that requires tribal consultation. Just not doing it, and just doing everything that it can to give energy, oil and gas to his cronies. There is I'm sharing this here. It's from an environmental and energy law.
Oh, the regulatory rollback tracker.
I know, isn't it awesome? It's very nerdy. But it's from Harvard, right? And they're keeping track of all the environmental regulatory rollbacks of the Trump administration. And if you scroll down, I mean, it gives you, there's your Bristol Bay Pebble Mine right there. And it gives you all the agencies involved, the status of the rollback, and the last update that they have. And so you see everything. There's Keystone XL. There's the Clean Water Act rule that was just rolled back. Endangered species.
See this stuff right here? This is scroll back up to the top of it.
I'm scrolling back to the top.
This is look, guys. This is what this jackass clown of a president.
Hey, don't get us kicked off YouTube, man. We got things to say.
No, we could say that. You can say that because everybody's called him worse.
Okay.
And especially now. So I'm prior military. I was a Marine, and now that I'm seeing, I served under some of his generals. Mad Dog Mattis was I served in one of his units when I was in, and we looked up to him. He was a good man. Another powerful white man, but he was a good Marine, I should just say. And to watch him, turn and say, "Hey, this is wrong. This is wrong."
So you're talking about not everyone may know what you're referring to.
Oh, well, General Mad Dog, the generals have turned their backs on the president, and because of his shit show that he's creating, and publicly they've been coming out and speaking against him.
Yeah.
And his current official, military official at this point, I'm not going to say all the names, but he even went on the news and said, "Hey, what I did was wrong. I shouldn't have went out there and pushed all the protesters off. They were peacefully protesting, and we moved everybody out with tear gas and all this stuff, and so that we can have a photo out in front of church." But here's what I'm getting at. And this is the long way around all this, because how does this affect us? How does this affect Indian country? Because we've been getting screwed all these years anyway. This is nothing new to us. So now everybody else is feeling what happens when somebody hits power and doesn't want you to have any.
Right.
This clown is creating a clown show so that this list can be created behind all of our backs without us knowing any of this is going on. This list right here is what's really going on, because all the stupid crap that he's saying, all the stuff that all his spoofs and faux pas, and he's going to go into Oklahoma and into Indian country tonight for his first big hoorah, and he's going to spout off something stupid, and another thing's going to get added to this list, and we're not going to know about it.
Right.
And that's the real crime, and what really is going on is that this list is being created, and the smoke and mirrors that this jackass is creating out there on the TV is hiding this list from all of us. This is what needs to be put out there. All of these things that they are doing, all the rollbacks that they're doing, what they're doing to our economy, what they're doing to Indian country, what they're doing to our native lands, what they're doing to our water, what they're doing to our air. That's the crime right there that's being committed.
Right.
And this list needs to be out in the open. People need to understand what's really going on.
Right. Because even, race is a social construct, right? I mean, race is not a real thing. It's something we've created.
Yeah.
And race is not important. Our health is important, but all of these things are reliant on our dependence to Mother Earth, our dependence on our natural environment, which is being completely obliterated.
Yeah.
And I'm so concerned and wish I had more capacity in the organization and the Association on American Indian Affairs to really, fight tooth and nail for every single one of these. A lot of times we try to partner with environmental groups and others who have more of that machine, that kind of governmental affairs machine that we can ride the coattails on a little bit. But so much more needs to be done, and people just need to be aware, I think, first off.
Yeah, no, you're right, and awareness is what has to. If you get a hold of this list, get that link, guys, and post it everywhere you can. Let people know what's going on. You can pull all of those up and look at what they're doing, and nobody's heard anything on any mainstream news about it. It's just happening. It's happening underneath COVID. It's happening. I don't even know if we can say that anymore. Everybody's getting all dinged on that, and so it's happening under this this jackass's, crazy stuff that he's doing, and the COVID pandemic. So this list needs to be put out. So.
Yeah, and what's great about this list, Roy, before we leave this topic, and again, look up regulatory rollback tracker on Google. You can click on any of these, and it gives you this great information about why this environmental law matters, the various pieces of the status, and what's happening procedurally. A little bit of the history, how it got passed, and what's happened in the Trump era. So really good website. I'm going to stop sharing that now. Where'd you go? What happened?
I'm sorry. There was a little emergency here outside my office.
What happened?
Kids, I have a 3-year-old,
Okay.
So anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, it obviously was.
But wait, I wanted to say one more thing. Did you finish talking about the list?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have one more thing to say before we bring our guest on, so he doesn't have to be sitting in the middle of this. I want to tell, and I know this, we've got our 20 people watching us, and a few hundred people watch this show, but I just got to say this on the record. Donald Trump Jr., you are a chicken shit for what you've done to Alaskan hunting regulations so that you can go out and kill whatever you want. You're a chicken shit, buddy. And that was really a low blow for humanity, what you did. So I just wanted to put my 2 cents in on that. Boy, I'm fired up this week. I'm telling you.
Well, we need to be, and we've got to do something with this energy. We've got to do something to make things better, because so much is going wrong. But be that as it may, something good is just about to happen, and we're going to bring on a very amazing young gentleman. I can call him a young gentleman because he's younger than me, and I don't know him that well. So.
Oh, so the guys you don't know are gentlemen. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Hey, it's Indian country. What do you want? So no, this man I truly respect. He is a young attorney. He's worked for his nation, the Crow Nation in Montana, and now he's in an elected position. He's an elected official in Bighorn County, Montana. He's their attorney. So, and I believe that county, he can tell us more about it, but I think it covers some of the reservation as well as non-Indian area. So he's going to tell us all about what he does, but he's extremely intelligent, knows a lot about the law. His name is Gerald Harris. We can call him Jay. Bring him up and see.
Let's bring Jay up.
And working today.
Welcome, chat room. By the way, welcome, chat room. We're glad to have you all here. Sandra, right? Is that our regular? Yeah, Sandra. All right, and without any further ado, here is our guest, Jay.
Jay.
Hey, Jay.
Hello. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Oh, we hear you perfectly. Sounds great.
We're working great. Good to be with you, Shannon. Good to be with you, Roy.
Absolutely.
Greetings from Big Sky Country.
So how has your week been?
Our weeks are pretty eventful. We deal quite a bit with the COVID situation. Of course, here in Bighorn County, we're still reporting positives, and we've developed an enforcement program for home isolation and quarantine, which is intended to incentivize folks to stay home. And we're really reluctant to involve the judicial process. It is authorized under Montana law, and that's something that we've spent some time on in recent weeks, developing, striking a balance between civil liberties and the importance of reasonable public restrictions on movement. And I hate to characterize it in that fashion, but that's, for a criminal prosecutor or anybody in the criminal justice system, you're thrust into that role. Everything is a balance. And we are, Bighorn County, the only jurisdiction in Montana that has taken this approach involving enforcement. All of the efforts thus far across the state almost uniformly have been regarding prevention. And now we're on the flip side of that discussion, which is enforcement for isolation and quarantine measures. And we can talk more about that, but that's what's swallowed a lot of the oxygen out of the room, so to speak, with our more recent efforts here, Bighorn County.
So what does Bighorn County encompass? So the area of Montana, because Montana's enormous.
Montana is a large state. I believe we're the 5th largest state, and we are a relatively large county, and we have about a little over 13,000 residents here. I call it the most dynamic jurisdiction in the state of Montana because we do have portions of 2 Indian country enclaves, of course, that being the Crow Indian Reservation and the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation. We border the state of Wyoming to the south. We border Montana's most populous county, Yellowstone County, to the west, which includes Billings. We're the only Indian reservation, or excuse me, the Crow Indian Reservation is the only reservation in Montana that has an interstate highway traveling through it. And we've got 2 national park enclaves, the Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area, as well as the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, several state parks. It's a really robust area for anybody that studies the law or practices the law. There's been U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have came from the Crow Indian Reservation and also from the periphery involving Crow tribal rights, including that case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court last year, Wyoming versus Herrera, which was a perhaps rare modern victory for tribal treaty rights. Of course, that involved the Crow Tribe's 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. So a very dynamic jurisdiction, to say the least.
Wow. So
Yeah, you're not kidding.
do you know Longmire?
Longmire, I haven't watched it, but I'm aware my family watches it. I know many people that watch it. It's a series. I think it was on A&E, perhaps. I'm not sure if they're still running episodes, but it's very popular.
Yeah, Netflix got it. So
Okay.
as you were talking, I was like, oh, he's like Longmire.
We're Longmire country. There's a community in northern Wyoming, Johnson County, about 2 hours south of us, Buffalo, Wyoming, and I think they have what are called Longmire Days still every summer. I'm not sure they'll have it this year because of the COVID restrictions, but that's I believe where the Longmire story is set, like in northern Wyoming, if I'm not mistaken. So they've sort of capitalized on that.
Sorry, I got us off track here. So tell us about where you're from and how you made a choice to be a lawyer.
Well, I was born in Crow Agency, which is the tribal seat of government here on the reservation. I was raised on the reservation. I grew up in the Lodge Grass area and graduated from Lodge Grass High School, class of 1999. And I went to undergraduate school, Rocky Mountain College in Billings. And I transitioned there from a rough and tumble kid rolling out of the hills off the reservation to someone that had incredible, and someone who does have incredible thirst for knowledge. I love to learn. I love to research. And originally I wanted to be in law enforcement. And I even spent summers working for the U.S. Forest Service, Bighorn National Forest, Shoshone National Forest, which are local to this area. And that was kind of the career path I was looking towards, but I always felt that pull or even paying towards remedying injustice. And the idea of making a difference in your community and being impactful in a positive way was always a draw to me, and which is why I was very interested in public service. My great-great-grandfather, his name was Robert Yellowtail. The Yellowtail Dam on the Crow Reservation is named for him. He's fairly notable because he was the first Crow Indian who was appointed as a BIA agency superintendent here on the Crow Reservation. He was served as tribal chairman mid-20th century, accomplished quite a bit in his life, and I've read quite a bit of his works, very inspired by a lot of what he did in his career. And he was very studied, very learned in the law, but he wasn't a lawyer. It was something that he was set to do at one point in time, and when he was a very young man, he traveled voluntarily to the Riverside Indian Institute in California, and he chose that school over another school that was on his short list to go to, Indian boarding school, because he really loved oranges. They were a luxury item at that time, the early 20th century. And he knew that oranges came from California. So he wanted to go someplace where, just like back home, you go out and pick choke cherries when they're in season. He thought he could go and pick oranges while he was at school. And he was there for years. They traveled down there by train. That was the mode of transportation at that time. And he was on a career path, an academic path at that point to go to law school. Would have been one of the first American Indians to do so. And he was called back home because there was a proposed legislation that was in the U.S. Congress that would have surplused all of the unallotted land on the Crow Indian Reservation under the Homestead Act that was being proposed by Montana's own U.S. Senator. And he was called upon by the tribal leadership because they knew he was studying law and he spoke English very well and knew legal terms. So he traveled with the delegation to Washington, D.C., and he's part of the congressional record and made compassionate speech before the U.S. Senate Indian Affairs Committee. This is all chronicled in a documentary titled Contrary Warriors that came out in 1985, which was actually a Sundance Film Festival entry, and successfully defeated the proposed legislation. And I believe the history reflects that there wasn't even a floor vote because of the convincing statements that he had made to the Indian Affairs Committee on behalf of the Crow tribe. And from that point moving forward, he was sort of swept up into tribal government and tribal public service, such that he didn't complete his education. But I feel like to some extent, I picked up the baton from that point and carried it forward as far as the idea of a lawyer in the family and trying to right wrongs, remedy injustices. And that's always kind of been a guiding light for me. And that's part of that reasoning or basis for wanting to be a lawyer.
Yeah. I'm sure he would be very proud of you today, Jay. So elected office. I was surprised to hear that, and I guess it's because, as Indian people, we are often fighting with state and federal agencies. And so when you see someone get elected in, what the hell was that like? And what was that decision making that got you?
Well, I was in the legal office at the Crow Tribal Legislative branch of government prior to winning election in 2014. And that was an extraordinarily rewarding job. It was something that was very fulfilling. We did a lot of productive work. It was very difficult to leave that job, quite frankly. But this community for years, especially on my return from law school, I should note I graduated from the University of Colorado School of Law in Boulder in 2009, and it came back home. And I seen where we had a lot of issues in the community with crime, rates of crime, violent crime, drug-related crime, specifically methamphetamine, and all of the efforts that we were making at the legislature, some of which were centered directly towards trying to address matters involving public safety. But a lot of the efforts that didn't directly relate to public safety, or at least which were perceived not to relate directly to public safety, I could see how it wasn't going to work as well or at all unless we had that foundational value in our community, which is safety. Something that much of America takes for granted. It's well documented, the disparities between Indian country and the mainstream portions of America when it comes to like victimization of certain types of violent crimes, especially victimization by women, violent crimes, especially of a sexual nature. There's a lot of issues that I felt, because of the dynamic that I was describing earlier with Bighorn County and its overlap with the Indian country jurisdictions. And granted, we're at a limit because our hands are somewhat tied. We don't have state of Montana does not have criminal prosecutorial authority in Indian country and crimes involving Indians. So we see a lot that we can't directly impact, but being part of the criminal justice system, as far as working with others, at times it feels like shooting pool with a rope, but at other times we've made great progress. And I see now where prosecutors, public prosecutors, district attorneys, county attorneys, U.S. attorneys all across the country, they stand as an intermediary between the criminal justice system, specifically law enforcement, and the public. And there is no other entity that stands in that same position. And that brings an extraordinarily important view to the table. And it's a very important position to hold. So I don't take the role, the duties, the authorities lightly. But when you have a prosecutor that's engaged with the community, that wants to improve the community, that wants to be proactive, and there are plenty of non-proactive prosecutors in this country. I call them quadruple P, passive paper pushing prosecutors. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we don't need. We need prosecutors that are going to be both holding criminals accountable, but also holding law enforcement accountable, holding everybody accountable to the law. And my perspective at the Crow Legislature was we need someone like that in office locally. That's the kind of U.S. attorney Montana deserves. That's the kind of Bighorn County attorney our local community deserves. So entering office, wanting to slay dragons and change the world, political, bureaucratic resistance on some fronts, and very positive, constructive engagement and extraordinary teamwork on other fronts. And so I would hear the members of the public talk about concern regarding public safety, some of which was directly impacting them. Neighbors suspected of being involved in drug distribution, family members that had a car stolen, a home burglarized, et cetera, and they would always ask, like, why isn't anything being done about this? And then so we have that perspective from the public, and then looking towards law enforcement, we see heroes, but we also see where there's shortcomings. And being a prosecutor with that dual perspective, it's an extraordinary opportunity to further and advance justice. I had a sense of it, but I didn't know fully exactly what it all entailed in terms of just precisely knowing, in this community anyway, what the precursors are to making it a better community and enhancing public safety. And then, like the chorus of voices you'll hear so much across the public service, it gets to a point where you can see the end zone, but to move the ball downfield, it takes resources, and it takes full on commitment, and a lot of which we don't have, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we've been able to accomplish some things in this community, I think, that have helped in large part to set a standard. I think we've set a standard for what Bighorn County expects and what they deserve in a local prosecutor. And I'm hoping that if there's any sort of positive reverberation to that more and more jurisdictions expect more and more from their public officials. So I'm not a career politician, and don't intend to serve beyond the current term that I'm in. And this is my commission right now, to serve my community, to do my best every moment, every day, every chance that I have. And just like the old ancient Athenian citizens code, to leave Athens a better place than what you inherited. That's the simple charge that I have, that I feel, both as a citizen and as a public official.
Wow. What happened, Roy? Did
I'm having some issues, it looks like, with the internet for some reason tonight. It's always something, right?
it's always something.
Well, Jay, that's very impressive. And of course, they've obviously got a gem with you there. I wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier about Riverside Indian School. It's still out here, and we support it as far as we have a powwow there every year, and there's a lot of activities that take place there. So it's kind of a gathering place for the community here. So we're always in big support of the people that are handling that school. So
Are there any oranges that grow nearby?
As a matter of fact, there's in Riverside, all the oranges are pretty much gone now. When I first moved into my home here, it was all orange groves. And so in the springtime, you could smell the orange blossoms. No, it was awesome. You woke up and walked outside and you just smelled these orange blossoms. But they build homes all over the place in the last 20 years since I've been here. And but there is a farm right across the freeway from the Indian School, and this farm is they grow all different types of exotic oranges. So they have some regular type sun-kissed type oranges, Southern California oranges, but they grow all kinds of different exotic pomelos and things from around the world. And they have this big farm, and you can go out there. And they have like a farmer's market that you can go to. So yeah, there is still right directly across from the school, across the freeway. There's a real big orchard there, and there's still some oranges. It was interesting you said that was why he came out, because he did land right in the middle of orange country here, because that's what this area is right here, was all orange groves.
The other choice he had was, I believe, the Sherman Institute. That was the other school that he was looking at. And he was not quite a teenager at that time when he left, and he spent years down there. So when he left, he knew he wasn't coming back for years. So that was a big decision for him to make. And then the capstone of that story is that he was in Crow agency. This is before leaving for California, before even making the decision to leave to go to school in an Indian boarding school off the reservation. And this is a story that was told to me by my great-grandmother. And she said that they were fishing along the banks of the Little Bighorn River, right below the railroad bridge over the river, still viewable to this day along Interstate 90 as you pass through Crow Agency. At any rate, there was 3 or 4 of them, and they're all 8, 9 years old, and they're fishing, and they're talking about things that the tribe's going through, public issues the tribe's dealing with, injustices that they are seeing as little boys, and they're contrasting the way they used to live, or the way that the tribe used to live just one generation before. He would have been this would have been in the 1890s. So this gives you some frame of reference how long ago this was. And he got up on one of those large sandstone rocks in the bank of the river, which you can still see to this day. And he told his friends that he was going to make the tough decision to leave, to get an education, and to use that as a basis to come back and to help the tribe and to address some of these issues that these little boys were talking about as they're fishing along the stream there. And my great-grandmother, a sparkle in her eyes, she's telling me the story. She said that was my dad's first political speech. And he made good on it, and that's something that I've got notes written down. So even the names of the little boys I have. So that's a nice little piece of we'll call that Crow oral history regarding nice. Robert Summers Yellowtail, who, by the way, the book The New Warriors, you may have read that book. It outlines a number of Native Americans throughout the 20th century, or American Indians throughout the 20th century, that were leaders and, dare I say, revolutionaries amongst their tribe. And The New Warriors is a book that does have a chapter that features his story. And others include Ada Deer, Russell Means,
Wow.
Janine Pease, I think Vin Deloria. It's a really good book. I'd encourage anybody to look at it. It's a really good snapshot of each of the lives and careers of those individuals.
Are you writing that down, Roy?
Yeah.
I was thinking about looking it up so I could share the side.
I haven't read that book.
All right.
So I've got a question. So speaking of the past and, your position now and how you grew up and the family that you grew up in, now that you being an elected official, lawyer, when you look at the nation and you look at what's the things that have been done, things that your father talked about changing or bringing back to the tribe, what was the biggest injustice that you see today of the past?
There are many, but they all spring from a singular concept, which is that an Indian person is somehow not a full, entitled citizen with all rights associated with citizenship, that were wards somehow inferior, that you have to actually certify or prove yourself competent to a federal agency before you're allowed to govern it to any extent land use if the United States holds legal title to your property. That fundamental perception, and that is rooted in law, of course, but there's so many issues that I would consider to be very unjust that spring from that idea. And you look at history and you look at the 19th century, especially the latter half of the 19th century, and there was this really odd hot to cold change where the United States is negotiating treaties with Indian tribes one day, and then considering tribes not suitable for negotiating treaties another day, and the individual Indians are wards with the United States as a guardian. And from that pivot point in history, you see a lot of the injustice that followed. And what I tell people when they ask questions about the history of the BIA, which is, we should always remain firmly in mind, the Cobell agency, they ask, like, why didn't it work? Like, why did the BIA role in governance on Indian reservations, why didn't that work? And that's a very involved, complex answer necessarily, but the simple way that I respond is, well, had we lost the Cold War to the Soviet Union in the 20th century, it would have been BIA for everybody. I mean, it suppresses individual liberty. There is certainly protections that need to be instituted and enforced to protect against vulnerable populations. And for sure, early on in the allotment era, individual Indians could have been and were, and sometimes were by the government, victimized, defrauded, abused, and hampered, and tribes as a whole. The schizophrenic history of federal Indian policy includes a time frame where the United States government didn't really perceive tribes as being self-governing entities. And this is mere decades from a point in time when they're viewed as sovereign nations with capacity to enter into binding treaties with the United States. So that perception does still pervade to degrees. It seems like it's become culturalized to some extent, but I would say, without going into a lot of detail about the various spokes that come from the center of this wheel, that viewpoint that an American Indian modernly is somehow lesser inherently because of their status associated with an Indian tribe, that should be rejected. It has no basis in any just law, and it has very little to do with the actuality of what Indian tribes were, are, and will be. insofar as being able to positively impact the world, the talents, the extraordinary talents and intelligence and capabilities of individual Indians and tribes working, Indians working together as tribes, and then tribes working together. That's the one thing I would definitely want people to realize and remember, is that the U.S. Congress passed a statute in 1871 that ended treaty making with tribes, and the Crow tribe never passed any law that ended treaty making with the United States, or with other tribes for that matter. So that's a unilateral expression of policy, which may or may not be worth the paper it's written on. Justice Clarence Thomas did note, cast some doubt, in fact, did note in that concurring opinion he wrote in a 2004 decision, United States Supreme Court, United States versus Lara, that that statute is perhaps unconstitutional because it unduly infringes upon the president's power to negotiate treaties. And he presents the question once and for all, calls federal Indian policy schizophrenic, and says once and for all, we need to address the question of whether tribes are sovereign, because the essence of sovereignty means it's your ability to make law, be governed by it to the exclusion of other sovereigns, is not dependent on another sovereign by definition. And if the federal government has power to set the metes and bounds of what a tribe can do legally without the tribe's consent, then that's not sovereignty. A tribal official, elected official at the legislature, asked me one time, "Are tribes really sovereign?" was his question. Are we really sovereign? And which is a good question. I asked him a question in response. Do you feel sovereign? Do you feel like you in this branch of government can make law that is truly law, and that another sovereign's not going to come in and say that it's not? And he didn't know. And I said, well, if you don't feel that you have the real power to make law that's going to govern our tribe, then you're not sovereign. But if you feel you do have that power, then you are sovereign. And that's the empowerment Indian people need to feel. And that's taking the reins of self-determination. And that's taking the reins of their future, ultimately. And if the BIA is going to have any role in the future, I would say it should be placed in the State Department as a special division of the State Department that will simply be the intermediary between the United States and tribes for purposes of negotiating compacts or agreements or treaties. And there'll be other U.S. departments that should be engaging tribes, but the BIA should be an agency that specializes in knowing what a tribe is in terms of its government, points of contact, structure, not telling a tribe what to do, not checking a tribe when it wants to exercise power, but simply being that expert agency within the federal government in the State Department that would be advisory to other federal agencies, and perhaps even advisory to the tribe to relate to the other federal agencies. That's what I would see moving forward in the future in terms of the role of the BIA, but that not to put it all on the shoulders of a single federal agency. After all, look at the history of the BIA in the 20th century, how much their wings got clipped at one point in time. They did everything. And over the course of time and into the 21st century, housing, healthcare, business development, agriculture, you name it, so many things have been taken away. Even the Indian Law and Order Commission that was established under the 2010 Tribal Law and Order Act, the report they issued to the President Congress called for the abolishment of the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services, replaced them with a uniformed law enforcement agency housed within the Justice Department and supervised by the Attorney General. And that's not an arbitrary recommendation. That's based on history and research and actual recent dynamics in what the shortcomings are when it comes to public safety. So to encapsulate all this, I would say that same thread of discussion earlier about it's really hard to start planning for a more vibrant future, enhancing your culture and economy, if you're afraid to leave your house to go get groceries because someone may come and take something or victimize your children. And those are the real thoughts. Those are thoughts that people have here locally. So maybe it's something along the lines of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, that we're really focused at that core level of safety and security. And those are the kind of things that if we can secure those and get people a real sense of empowerment, the future looks very bright. And going back just for a second to that citizenship concept, isn't it interesting that across the board, Indians in this country became U.S. citizens in 1924 by act of Congress, several years after Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens across the board by act of Congress, despite the plain language in the 14th Amendment. You're born in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. If you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, you're a citizen. Who is more subject to the jurisdiction of the United States than Indians? But there is case law that went to the Supreme Court that said that that wasn't the intent of Congress or the states when the 14th Amendment was ratified. So we, as Indians, our U.S. citizenship rests apparently on the benevolence of Congress. I shudder to think what would happen if that act gets repealed. But on the other hand, maybe that's the kind of discussion, again, that needs to be had about the future of tribes and what sovereignty really is. And those are the kinds of things that, unless you can have stronger foundation to launch from, tribal officials, individual tribal members, everybody's going to be focused on the more core day-to-day problems and dynamics, putting food on the table. So economic security, political security, those are all necessary ingredients for tribes to be what tribes are by law and to capture their own future.
I'll vote for you.
Thank you.
So if this 14th Amendment that you were talking about,
The
I'm not gonna act like I know what you're talking about or any of what you just said. I do, but I don't. I'm not as eloquent as you, obviously. But if the 14th Amendment was to be abolished, tossed aside, maybe things have to be wrecked before they can be fixed, type of situation. Is that what you were alluding to? Because, I mean, like you said, do you feel sovereign under this protectionism guise? Do Native peoples feel sovereign? Because that's where all the control comes from, is from this protectionism and this ward of the state issue. They've kind of superseded sovereignty by utilizing those tools and the BIA to keep tribes from actually exerting their sovereignty. Correct?
I believe that is correct. That's very fair. In the mid 20th century, Ralph Nader wrote a paper while he was at Princeton, and it was a people without a future. He quoted a Crow Indian, as a matter of fact, part of the subtitle to that article. And it's an enlightening article, and it speaks to the injustices that have been experienced at that point in history. But I don't think the title is entirely accurate, because it's not a people without a future. It's a people at that time, I think it would have been fair to say, with a clouded future. But tribes are extraordinarily resilient. That's one of the things that tribes bring to the table of discussion. And one of the things that gives, in my opinion, and I think many people would agree, gives tribes extraordinary credibility on an international level, because of the incredible ability and the incredible resolve through the course of centuries, despite the hardships, trials, tribulations, the culture is still vibrant. The people are still happy. And very few ethnic groups in this world have had such crushing blows to like basic fundamental rights, individual rights. And the story is well detailed, but what's not as clear is the future and where you go from here. What we have right now in this country is a dynamic that implicates very basic societal structure, the economy, public health, criminal justice, integrity of the political system. And look at the history of Indians. Every one of those things have been extraordinarily woven into the fabric of the history of the Indian people. And yet we're here, resilient, culture's thriving, happy. Things could be better for sure, but what kind of lesson can be drawn from that? And the one thing that I would say for sure is that it's the power of believing that justice will prevail. Well, we know that justice isn't going to happen on its own. It's not going to just come to being. We know that justice requires fights. It requires effort. It requires energy. It requires that resilience. The forces of injustice are working around the clock nonstop. So I don't know that everything would need to be burned to the ground, so to speak, but in a proverbial sense, I think that there needs to be some major cleansing, no question about it, and some fundamental reexamination of what is accepted and what is our real expectation. So that goes back to questions like the Indian Citizenship Act. It goes to questions like, do we really need a Bureau of Indian Affairs? It goes to questions like, what if the tribes say we don't like the idea of our treaties that we negotiated being interpreted in a federal courtroom? We want a special commission to be established that we can have sit-down negotiations to figure these things out. Those are the types of discussions and those are the types of issues that I believe part of that foundation from the legal perspective, that foundation will be very strong if that's the mindset that is had. Now, what is it going to take? The Dakota Access Pipeline protests were a flashpoint moment in time that I was really hoping would evolve to become broader and bigger to address some of these long outstanding issues. If I ever had a year sabbatical to write a novel or two, I would write a book about what would happen if a tribe was in litigation and with the United States or in a federal court and lost the case, thought that it was a wrong decision, and decided they weren't going to follow the mandate of the court order and wanted to negotiate an outcome through the terms of a treaty. What would happen? Can tribes do that? Absolutely. But the novel would be the series of events that would follow. What would happen? What would likely happen? And there's a factor at play that I think would help guarantee that it's not going to be the U.S. Marshals show up armed, wanting to enforce the court order, and they're repelled by armed tribal officers, and it's a standoff. And the next thing you know, there's tanks rolling down the streets of Crow Agency and airstrikes. Nothing. It's not. No. What's going to happen is you're going to have the fourth branch, the media, come into the picture, and you're going to have a story, and you're going to, and that's the kind of attention and the kind of discussion that I think these types of issues are going to receive. I don't know what the flashpoint moment is going to be that's going to bring it to the forefront, but ideally, in a more just world, there's a parallel universe perhaps where things are a little bit more just. This might be initiated by the federal government. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission is appointed by the president. Mm-hmm. And among the various things that they advise is to re-engage tribes on a treaty-making basis. Think about all the litigation that's occurred over the course of just the 20th century alone. My tribe, the Crow tribe, for 20 years litigated with the state of Montana as to who had the ultimate authority to tax coal. And that could have been addressed if Congress simply had just passed a law that preempted the state from taxing Crow coal. And okay, problem solved. What's the next issue? A proactive federal government, just like a proactive prosecutor, can make all the difference. And if you had the federal government reaching out to the tribes in this fashion, think about that. The president negotiates a treaty, sends it to the Senate, Senate ratifies, the House of Representatives is not involved. And that statute from 1871 that says no more treaties with tribes, perhaps someone would come into the courtroom, someone was standing, maybe the House themselves, arguing that this treaty violates the statute. And then we can have real discussion as to the power of the Constitution regarding Indian affairs. And to me, the founders of this Constitution that we have in this country perceived tribes to be sovereign, but they just left it to negotiation, referencing tribes in the treaty process, Indian Commerce Clause. So I think that was intended primarily to regulate U.S. citizens in their commercial dealings, relationship with tribes, not to be considered like some kind of carte blanche source of authority, quote unquote, plenary power to do what they might in anything they want with regards to tribes, including abrogating treaties and abolishing sovereignty. Those are ridiculous concepts. But perhaps this is something that could evolve from mere academic discussion. But I would leave that to the listeners, and I would leave that to Indian country as a whole to continue to have these discussions, to have these expectations, and hopefully it doesn't take violent protests or any tragedy or travesty to have a greater sense of why these things are necessary. Hopefully they can happen because they're the right things. And of course, then that gets back into that discussion about like who's in office and what efforts are being made, which I as a criminal prosecutor, we maintain strict neutrality when it comes to politics, in the sense of elected officials in a policymaking capacity. We certainly are aware of what's happening, cognizant of the world. But the one thing that I really like about the contrast between legislative and executive, at least insofar as prosecution is concerned, speaking to an executive power, is that there's this delicate balance where we are shielded from the political process, yet we rely on the political process because we're enforcing law that was created by a legislature and enacted by the people's representatives, or perhaps even by the people themselves. And there's an extraordinary trust that's built as a result, because people expect their elected leaders to make the right decisions when it comes to policy. And they also expect public prosecutors to be very diligent in enforcing those laws and policies when necessary. And we're playing with live bullets, and we're dealing with things that impact people's future. And one of the very fundamental reform measures that may be needed in this country is to ensure that basic civic value is throughout this country a standard and expectation that's demanded. Every police chief, every commissioner, county, state, local governor, legislator, prosecutors, everybody, the president, the Congress, everybody's got to have that real sense of civic duty to protect the public, especially those most vulnerable, to remedy injustice, and to give the public confidence that there is a future that's worth fighting for, worth living for. So as I was noting before, when you're asking the question about injustices in Indian country, I think there is a sense of powerlessness that can pervade at times. We have extraordinary rates of substance abuse, for example, that I think do spring from what incentive do I have to remain sober? What incentive do I have to live a good, clean, productive, hardworking life, delayed gratification, sacrifice, things that mainstream society would reward, things that are expected of a law-abiding individual that's going to be a contributing member of society, things that are taken for granted throughout this country. We don't have that in surplus here in Bighorn County. We have a lot of folks that are in the grip of addiction, and a lot of broken home dynamic that fosters victimization of children. And that sense of disempowerment is throughout, and the unresponsiveness of government is throughout. It's a theme that's throughout this narrative. So, and I know that the Crow and Northern Cheyenne reservations are not the only that are experiencing this dynamic. So, this is part of the discussion regarding why we have missing, murdered Indigenous people in and near Indian country. The idea that there's a lot of impactful tragedy that young people will see or experience or be themselves the victims, and unremedied, unaddressed. And then you have a point in time where individuals are going to coalesce, join together for good or for bad. And if you have a community rife with victims and unaddressed trauma, and there's structure that's lacking because of substance abuse, then there's going to be less accountability or no accountability when it comes to where young people are at. And then people will feed off that and serve as predators towards that dynamic. And because that's so relatively common throughout Indian country, if that's not an alarm signal, I don't know what is, for us to have a really serious examination of what we need to be better and to do better in our communities across the country. And I knew that was...
But those things are symptoms of poverty that have been going on. Legislatively, how do we get out of that? The underlying problem, yes, we have all of these issues, but those are issues that have been brought about by poverty, the destruction of your culture, the destruction of your legal system, the destruction of your government, the destruction of your police force, all of those things are indicative of what is, the underlying problem is poverty, and the ability to not be able to rise up out of that. Legislatively, what can tribes do, or what are tribes doing, or what are you guys looking at when it comes to that, to try and remedy that, to start to bring those people out of it?
Well, specifically with the Crow Indian Reservation, it's a large reservation. It's 2.2 million acres, and it has an extraordinary resource base. It's perhaps the greatest agricultural Indian reservation in the country, farming and ranching. Everybody that spent time here everybody has the same sense of extraordinary potential, unrealized or undeveloped. And a lot of Indian country enclaves throughout the United States have tremendous resources, agriculture in some instances, minerals in others, gaming in others, timber, fisheries. But one of the injustices, if you will, that's threaded through this history of where we came to get us to where we are today is the displacement of Indian people, where the tribes were located at the time that the United States was established and that the United States formed its relationship with Indian tribes. They were there for a reason. They were there because it was an area that could support them. It was an area they loved. It was an area that they had vibrant economic ability to survive and thrive. And then you have displacement in many instances. The Crow tribe never took up arms with the United States, forged an alliance with the U.S. government as early as 1820 with the first treaty that the Crow tribe had with the United States of America. It's known as the Friendship Treaty. It was a mutual defense treaty, and it was viewed by the Crows as a strategic alliance. This was a way to secure the Crow homeland that had been dearly fought for years. Other tribes weren't as fortunate with their dealings, and then some tribes thought similarly that they would engage the United States in that fashion, but were not exactly treated fairly from the federal government. And there's a lot of historic Indian country, which is not modern Indian country. So the reverberation of that dynamic exists today, and it exists heavily in some areas. Some of the reservations in South Dakota, for example, there's folks there that I'm hoping there's still thought, feeling, and belief that there is going to be a sense of justice, if not reality, to a just outcome when it comes to some of the historic land claims that they have, that essentially the government of the United States decided that it would take land, I'm talking about the Black Hills, from the Sioux tribe against the tribe's will, and other tribes have similar stories. How that gets remedied, what solutions are available to be placed on the table, there's probably far more than what could ever be employed in our lifetimes, but the discussions need to happen, and that's part of that engagement, where if the tribe is a sovereign entity, then you're at a equal playing field and a table of truth. That whole idea, great white father. I wrote a paper in law school where I present this as a theme, that it should have been the great multicultural brother, not the great white father. And I was conceptualizing tribes modernly as independent local governments, which their sovereignty doesn't spring from the states, doesn't spring from the United States. They're local governments by virtue of being localized in nature, although a tribe like the Navajo seems to be more akin to a state because of its enormous size. And those are the kinds of things that I don't hear that too much from Congress. In fact, when I see federal statutes that are passed by Congress involving Indians, not to be too cynical, but one of the first things I look to is just to see what phrase they use to reference Indians. Sometimes they reference Indian tribes, Indian tribal governments, tribes, the various ways they refer to tribal courts. It's anybody that wants to see exactly the example of Congress not knowing what they did yesterday when they're dealing with Indian tribes. Look at the right-of-way laws that Congress has passed over the course of years. It's extremely uneven, and it looks like Congress is ignorant of what it had passed before when it's enacting new law, or what it passed regarding specific Indian reservations. And that's been fueled to extraordinary amounts of litigation because of I guess I'll call it the difficulty maybe inherent in congressional delegations representing tribal interests at the same time representing off-reservation interests. But there again, that goes to the discussion of should tribes have voting delegates in the Congress. I believe some tribes actually had secured representatives in Congress in their treaty language, and some tribes I think would be very interested in having non-voting delegates, but a voice at the table in a true nation-to-nations relationship and nation-to-nation in policymaking. Every tribe is a nation. So I really feel like the state of Montana is a lot better situated than it was 25, 30 years ago with respect to dealing or relating with Indian tribes. It's not cowboys and Indians anymore. We do have a pretty fair number of Indians in the state legislature. The governor does have an office called the Office of Indian Affairs. And I think that's the case with many states, some notable exceptions. But states were called at one point in American history. I think it was maybe one of the Marshall Trilogy cases from many years ago, the deadliest enemies of tribes.
Right.
But that's not our current situation, at least not here in Montana. Our Board of County Commissioners here in Bighorn County, 2 of the 3 elected representatives are Crow Tribal members. Myself, as the county attorney, the sheriff is a Crow Tribal member. Our Bighorn County Justice of the Peace is also a Crow Tribal member, as are many other of our elected county officials. So we're taking over. What I see as an honor is to be in this position and to treat everybody fairly. And if there was anybody that had apprehension about me getting elected, being an Indian, oh, he's going to treat non-Indians unfairly. We treat everybody fairly, because I believe that not only is a requirement by law, it's a requirement of American morality, and it's also a hallmark feature of traditional tribal value systems.
Right.
Yes.
And so that's something that I think people, when they realize what tribes really are, they're not going to, it's not the boogeyman in the closet. It's something to be very, very proud of, to be a part of a country that has this type of cultural diversity. And when you really start looking at the history, some of which we're talking about, it does need reparation, it does need remedy, and it does need some greater effort.
So let me stop you right there at reparations, because that's a dirty, dirty word when it comes to the U.S. government. When you start talking about reparations, I'm going to try and turn my camera off because it looks like I'm just.
And we got to
having
look at that
problems.
funky like pirate thing you got. That is.
It's like my Google thing. But anyway, so how I saw this woman that was with Black Lives Matter speaking out against the injustices that the African Americans have had over the years, and she phrased it very well. She said, "Look, you guys have been playing Monopoly. You played 100 rounds of Monopoly, and then you let us come and play. We started to get up. We started to move. You guys already had everything, all the hotels on all the expensive properties, and everything was already won. And then you burned the game. And then you told us, let's play again." And so that's how she looked at it and how they've looked at it. And then when I take a look at it from the Indians' point of view, from the Native American point of view, from Indian country's point of view, how do we get out of that situation? You talk about agriculture, and we had another gentleman on the show that we were talking about, okay, so how do we create some economic energy to get out of these messes, other than casinos and things? How do we get into the manufacturing world? How do we get into the agricultural world? How do we actually compete and help tribes lift themselves up financially so that we can get out of this impoverishment that I'm talking about, to help to solve some of the problems that poverty has brought about? And I know that money doesn't solve everything, but it sure does help. And it sure, I've seen it help other in the nations that have gaming, for instance, where they've built hospitals and they've built mental development centers and schools and cultural centers and all of these things, and it has improved the quality of their lives. So how do we get our tribes to actually seek reparations, get reparations, so that they can have better lands to grow on, better manufacturing facilities, things like that? Where does that begin?
Well, my view on that would be that old Christian proverb: you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, you teach them how to fish, then you feed them for the lifetime. Education is extraordinarily important in this discussion. Chief Plenty Coup, the last great chief of the Crow tribe is famously quoted as saying, with education, you are the white man's equal. Without education, you are his victim. And in speaking of reparation, I would say that the tools to succeed need to be in the hands of Indians. This is something that has been promised from virtually the beginning of the relationship between tribes in the United States. Certainly in the course of the 19th century, you see that specific language in treaties where education, provision for advancement of Indian economies, whether agriculture or otherwise, those are specific provisions. And the reparation is basically a long time coming of delivery of past promises. And the federal government has an extraordinary public land base, which I'm not saying that Congress needs to start conveying lands back to the tribe, although I think that should be on the table for discussion. But look at what happened. Let's see, in 2004, Congress passed a statute that amended federal law that governs management of public resource lands that have forests. So both the Bureau of Land Management administered lands, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, national forests, such that any Indian reservation that borders lands that are administered by Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of Interior, the tribes can enter into, some people call them 638 contracts. This wouldn't be a 638 contract per se, but conceptually they're very similar in nature. But tribes can enter into management agreements for the off-reservation forests to basically manage the forest in lieu of the federal agency or in partnership with the federal agency for, among other things, a focus on enhancing wildlife habitat, for example. If the tribe has an off-reservation treaty hunting right, that makes a lot of sense. And for the states in which those national forests are situated, it makes a lot of sense because if there's more animals for every hunter, including the non-tribal hunters, then it's a win-win-win for everybody. And it's something that would bring tribes to the table in a very productive, positive way. It means jobs. These are the kinds of things that are labor intensive. It's helping clean up our own backyard, federal public resources. It's doing it in a way that if tribes have a little panache, and one of those aspects is land stewardship and sustainable cultivation and harvest. I believe it's the White Mountain Apache that have a tradition of leaving the first deer when they go hunting. They don't shoot the first animal they see. It's a guarantee that there'll always be animals when they go hunting in the future. And those are the kind of conservation ethics that helped sustain them as a people and connected them deeply with the land. And the reparation, to me, at least in so far as the federal level, is a delivery of what was always promised, and to start thinking outside the box as far as what can happen in the future, working in coalition and partnership with tribes. And individual Indians should have every tool at their disposal. As I was noting, education is key. Robert Yellowtail lived a tremendous life and had a lot of success, but he was given that opportunity. He had the choice of the Sherman Institute or the Riverside Institute. He was bold enough to make that step, knowing he wasn't going to be coming back for years at a very young age. That kind of boldness, that kind of step, I think that is still part of the DNA. It's in our blood as an Indian people. Which ethnic group in this country has the highest rate of enlistment in the military branches? Native Americans. And they fought valiantly over the course of American history. And speaking of injustice, at times fought valiantly for a country that they would return home and go to areas where there was signs on business doors, no dogs or Indians allowed. That was in Sheridan, Wyoming. And that was the experience of Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow, who won the Presidential Medal of Honor late in his life for his exploits in Germany during World War II. And there's far better thinkers when it comes to how to remedy the past injustices in a non-courtroom setting, in a policy-making setting. But to me, the seeds need to be planted for that. And maybe Friday, June 12th, 2020, some of these seeds are getting planted. I'm really hoping so, because these are the types of discussions that need to be recapitulated across the country, from coffee table to coffee table and off reservations. And I'm hoping there's a growing movement that can take place, and that people can articulate specifically what they want, what they demand, and what their expectations are. That's what makes the future exciting, especially if government's actually responsive. And I know that's a whole nother discussion, but what we're doing here, I guess, is we're piloting a potential roadmap, but exactly who drives it and where it goes, I'll leave that, I guess, to the politicians. But there was a former president that said there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. So there are Irish Americans, there are African Americans, there are Italian Americans, and there's also American Indians. We put America first. How about that?
Yep. I like that. I like that a lot. Right on.
So what are you growing here, Jay? Like, do you see yourself going into political office later on? I mean, what's the future hold for you? Because I'm hearing some powerful statements coming from you.
Well, I've taught at Little Bighorn College here locally, business law courses, Indian law. I even was able to design my own course that I taught one semester, which was the law governing Crow land use. That was a lot of fun.
Wow.
I could see myself getting into academia, politics. I'm not so sure. I feel like I need to take a time out when it comes to public service and all the various demands that public service entails. You never say never, right? But I don't have any plans for continued public service, although any patriot, when called to duty, must keep the powder dry. So what I really hope to see is a government that is truly from the people, not a government that comes at the people. And that's the kind of revolution perhaps that's in the works right now. I don't know exactly the percentages, but I recall there being several presidential election cycles where there's 40% or better of American citizens that don't vote. That's an enormous reservoir of power. And whatever it takes, whatever is needed to spring to life folks that are apathetic to the extent they don't want to vote. If we had another hour discussion, we could get into some of the electoral college and things like that are discouraging factors when it comes to
obviously we have to do another show. We definitely do. Because it sounds like we can drag a lot more out of you.
Well, and that's an important discussion as we and Jay, if you are willing to have that conversation as we go into the towards November, I think we need to have. I know there's been a couple of questions that some of our folks on chat have asked. Roy, do you want to? There was a question about the Civil Rights Act, and I think she means 1966 here.
Yeah, Civil Rights Act.
How does the Civil Rights Act serve Native acts of violations?
How is it contrary to sovereignty?
Yeah.
So are we talking about the 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act or the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Civil Rights Act. So I don't know specifically. I'm thinking she means just the
it's a 64, right?
The 64 Civil Rights Act.
Okay. Well, the first thing to know about the 1964 Civil Rights Act is that it does not extend to, at least not on its face, the statute doesn't extend to tribes, so it doesn't have any impact to the exercise of authority by an Indian tribe. That was later done by Congress in 1968 through the Indian Civil Rights Act. But even then, and curiously enough, it was the Crow Tribal Chairman, Edison Rilbert, at the time that testified before the Senate Indian Affairs Committee while that was still in the legislative process to take the Attorney General out as an enforcement provision. And the only federal court review available for the Indian Civil Rights Act is habeas corpus. So if only if and when a tribe detains somebody is that potentially reviewable in a federal court after appropriate tribal court exhaustion, of course. But the 1964 Indian Civil Rights, or excuse me, the 1964 Federal Civil Rights Act does protect Indians for the purposes of its general language that prohibit certain types of discrimination. The EEOC is the one of the primary enforcement arms, along with, of course, the Department of Justice. And I believe it was the EEOC that recently issued a report to Congress talking about how they're just simply understaffed and under-resourced to take on the volume of complaints that they receive that are would potentially be subject to federal enforcement under the Civil Rights Act. So it is it is an underfunded agency. The EEOC, the Department of Justice, has in recent years spent decent amount of resources with the Voting Rights Act amendments to the Civil Rights Act in terms of enforcement, but I don't know of any real notable cases here locally that spring from the Civil Rights Act, and I think that speaks volumes. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that the federal agencies are relegated to do when they're resource strapped, and this would be similar to what the Federal Trade Commission does with consumer protection, for example, they'll take the big cases. So when you have potentially a large bank that might be engaged in some type of scheme, or they're extraordinarily negligent, it's costing people lots of money, then you'll see some federal action. Otherwise, they just take aggregate data and they try to see what trending is in a particular sector of the economy. And so they welcome complaints, but there's not going to be much in the way of enforcement or even investigation. And I'm afraid that's where we're at with the Civil Rights Act. I don't know for sure, but having read that report recently, which, by the way, the reason I was referencing that most recent report to Congress from the EEOC was I wanted to see what, if anything, was being related to Indian country. And specifically, I was researching the missing, murdered Indigenous persons dynamic, which I do consider a civil rights issue. And I was looking to see whether or not there had been any formal action of any sort that was being recommended by Congress or for Congress, or whether there was any statistical information that was being collected. In other words, whether the federal government was looking at it as a civil rights matter or a civil rights issue as well. So, and the answer to that at this point would be no. Obviously, the federal government sees the MMIP as an issue. I mean, the president did sign an executive order in November of 2019 establishing Operation Lady Justice, which I sort of conceptualize as White House are clunking heads together with the federal agencies to get everybody on the same page. I think the ultimate value of that's going to be what is done once Congress and the White House are fully and formally briefed on what inherent shortcomings exist. But the immediacy of positive impact there was all of a sudden it became a buzzword that you could gain traction with our federal partners. It's something that had media spotlight, and it was something that created a sense of momentum and urgency. And it's one of the one of the really negative aspects of the COVID emergency is that it has drawn attention away from movement and momentum on that particular issue. But I consider myself a student of the Civil Rights Act and the various enforcement potential that it has. I do have a portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. as one of my heroes in my office. And anytime I feel overwhelmingly disgusted, I go to, when it comes to world events and man-on-man injustice, I go to his collection of writings and how much resolve he had in a position of leadership and how much vision he had, despite himself being the subject of many of the injustices.
And such a young man too.
Yeah.
And it very much so. And he spoke of reparation for not just Southern Blacks, but for all similarly situated persons that were the victims or even products of racial discriminatory public policies, of public actions. There is something to be said about having that affirmative action policy to try to level the playing field and to create a level plane. That I believe that term affirmative action, it comes from, I believe it comes from a judicial decision from that era. And it sprung forward and been sort of integrated into the body politic in this country. But what does it mean ultimately in a modern context moving forward? That's part of the discussion. That's part of what needs to be redefined and examined, because there is a public role for reparation. What precisely it is, that to me, that should be a very dynamic discussion, and people shouldn't be hunkered on Team Blue and Team Red throwing grenades at each other. It should be a very vibrant discussion that brings people together. And if it's going to benefit America, it's going to have to benefit all Americans. The rising tide, lifting all boats concept. And that's the thing that I think people forget about with our economy is that money is like I guess it's been analogized to stock waste, or if it's piled in the corner, it's not going to do anything. But if it's spread out evenly, things will grow. It enriches the soil, and that's why it's called currency. It's supposed to move. It's supposed to be in a current, in a flow. And if you've got an economy there, more people are touching that dollar bill. I guess to the extent we're still going to be dealing with dollar bills in the future, the more fingerprints on that dollar, the better. And one thing about us Indians, we love to spend money. We may not have much, but we'll spend it, what we do have. And that Indian country is a tremendous pool of aggregate consumer demand. And we'll go shopping and we'll buy products. And in fact, we're going to be major contributors to an economy. So these are the types, I believe, of common ground discussion points that would bring liberals, conservatives, everybody to the table for discussion. And the uniqueness that Indians have at this discussion is legal status as Indian nations. And that's something that maybe not always to great benefit, but certainly in some instances to great benefit, has been an economic driver for Indian tribes. And then of course you can point to gaming and mineral extraction, etc. But there again, the role that I have today and will have tomorrow is, along with others in law enforcement, criminal justice, we're trying to keep a solid foundation for others to launch from. And we're kind of, we're not the we're not the astronauts necessarily, but we're the platform techs. We're the people that are working on the rockets, and we're hoping that the public can launch to greater prospects in the future and be successful, and that people can live in a community where they're happy, they're productive, law-abiding, playing by the rules, maybe pay a few taxes, and they're going to be protected, and they're going to be able to raise children and live safely, and ultimately retire and be happy, and watch whatever streaming series they choose. And and some people are going to be superstars, and others are going to be happy as someone that is watching the game. That's, to me, the American dream is defined by your own vision of excellency and expectation, but it's really that American exceptionalism concept means that you can do it. You have the ability to become, within practicality and reason, what you want to become. And with a little bend your elbows to the task, roll up your sleeves, you should be able to be the highest, best version of yourself. That spark of confidence needs to be in the hearts and minds of every Indian person in this country. And you'll see a revolution of a nature that, well, I think, speaking of launch pads and platforms, in our lifetimes, we'll see tribes take their rightful role of prominence on the international level, maybe even brokering deals in a international diplomatic sense between foreign countries. And to me, that's going to be certainly a sight to behold for considering the past and what we've gone through. But I believe it will happen. So anyway, I'll jump off the little sandstone rock near the river now. And
Jay, it's been awesome. I mean, I could sit here and listen to you all night. I wish we had some more time.
I know
We're
you're
running
making
up.
our job so easy, Jay.
I
I'm
just sit
telling
here
you,
and
we're
listen.
working you
You need
hard,
your
and I'm
you
just
need your
like,
own show, man.
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, the content. We got to have you back. Can we get you back on here?
I would be honored to come
towards the
back.
election.
Absolutely. I'll be honored to come back, and just let me know any Friday. I'm not in the midst of a trial and worn out, ready to hit the couch when I get home. I'm available. I wanted to say one thing though in closing. My Crow name, my Apsaalooke name, is pronounced Awachawa Algain Chawagish, and it's interpreted as praise on top of the mountain. And I wanted to share a quote from a Crow chief. His name was Elik Chiahush, and the quote is, "Of all things created, the mountains alone have escaped the domination of the white man, and to be near them is to be on the pathway to peace. Those of you who are wise will become educated in the white man's school, but I would still have you cling to the memories of your fathers, and I would still have you go up to those mountains and seek visions, so your hearts may be pure and strong." Elik Chiahush is interpreted as Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup's biography, written by Frank Linderman, was titled American. And I was honored to be part of this program tonight.
Thank you, Jay. We appreciate you, and that was awesome. We'll definitely get you on here in another couple months as we get closer to this election, and we've got a lot more things to talk about. That's for sure. So thank you again. Shannon, you got anything you want to close with?
Completely inspired. Thank you, Jay. You want to bring Jay down, but stay there with us, Jay. Don't go away. Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that the Association on American Indian Affairs produces this wonderful show. Thank you, the association. And we've got 2 grants that we have closing dates on. We give funding for American Indian graduate and undergraduate students from federally recognized tribes and tribes that are not recognized by the federal government as sovereign. So go to our website and look for our scholarships. And then second, we have summer camp scholarships. So if you have a Native Youth summer camp, you're able to do the summer camp and keeping the kids safe, social distancing, and what have you, please apply for a summer camp scholarship to help with your camp expenses. These are both, the deadline is June 15th, so it's like Monday. So please apply. I want to thank all the wonderful board of directors of the Association on American Indian Affairs who are supporting this and this work. And Roy, I want to thank you as a co-host. You've been great. I don't know what the hell is going on with you tonight with all your black background and weird internet stuff. And see, there he goes again. But so I guess I better close for him since Roy is having issues with his internet. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't have more discussion with the chat. Please be sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and come back next week where we'll be hosting our show with Santee Frazier, who's from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Santee is a poet and author, and I think you're really going to enjoy spending some time with him. So good night, everyone. Yakoki, thank you. I don't know how to turn this off. Oh, here we go.